There's a story my dad told me. Apparently, I have multiple ancestors that go back to the Mayflower. One was Job Scott. In the records about the voyage, there was a terrible storm. Waves crashing all about, everyone fearing for their lives, and all at once, a real monster wave crashed over the deck and swept Job right off the side. That was the end of poor old Job, except the very next moment, another monster wave crashed across the deck, dumping a very wet, very surprised, and very much alive Job Scott right back on the deck. And that is a true story. There's another story in my family of a Native American ancestor. The story was apparently quite scandalous, but no one I have ever met has any of the details. I remember asking my father, who shrugged. My grandparents are sadly long departed, but my aunts and uncles know the story, and they too, though, can only shrug. This abbreviated tale has apparently been handed down for generations. It's like a myth, something buried. If there's any truth to it, it seems to be lost to time. But my dentist had questions. Apparently, there are grooves on the back of my teeth, the same grooves on the teeth of my kids. For the record, my wife, Julia, is groove-free, a status that she cheerfully disputes. Anyway, it turns out that these features are common to people of Asian or Native American descent. Guess what? I have 0% Asian or Native DNA, or so says Ancestry.com. It's a mystery. Now, I know Ancestry and 23andMe and these other DNA analysis companies, they're not perfect. They need huge data sets to work and rely on continually updated algorithms to make their guesses. They're getting better. One day, they may be able to pinpoint our ancestors, where they lived, what they were like, but that day is not today, and I get it. Now, don't raise your hands, but I am wondering, has anyone here ever used one of these tools? Personally, I think they're exciting and interesting. I'm not sure helpful is the right word, but they're interesting. I will say that knowing that my ancestors were white and British was not a shock to me. I mean, look at me. But apparently I am 1/3 Scottish, 1/4 Irish, and the rest of me comes from England with just a dash of Wales for some extra spicy flavor. Well, not surprising. I will submit that my DNA results have been largely disappointing to me. Given my obsession with pasta, I would have liked to have seen at least one iota of Mediterranean blood somewhere in these veins, but alas and alack, I'm apparently just addicted to carbs. In preparing for this sermon, this St. Patrick's Day service, I spent a fair bit of time thinking about Irish things: the color green, boiled potatoes, leprechauns, Guinness Irish stout. I had imagined that I could play off of a wonderful book by Tom Standish called The History of the World in 6 Glasses, which is why that is the title of this sermon in your order of service. As you may expect, the book talks about how beverages changed the world. Beer in Mesopotamia, wine in ancient Greece, rum in the Caribbean, coffee in Western Europe, tea in England. And what is it, soda or pop? Soda, pop, anybody? So this apparently varies by region, and we right here are on a line. So what is it? Soda. Yeah, whatever. But this is what we Americans have contributed to the mix of world beverage. Yeah. What I did learn from Standish, however, is that whiskey is Irish. I will offer that my Scottish DNA is a bit scandalized by this, but apparently it's true. Wine grapes just don't grow all that well in the British Isles, and that left the Christian monks, who clearly had too much time on their hands, without access to tasty adult beverages beyond beer. Being inventive, these clever lads fermented anything that sat still long enough. Sat still. Still? Get it? Yeah, that's a fermentation joke. Yeah, really, that's the best I have. It's all downhill from here. Anyway, these monks turned to fermenting grain mash. One of those delightful fruits became whiskey. Now, to hear the Scots tell it, whiskey emerged in Scotland about the same time the English were getting pushed around by the Normans. But while we Scots can angrishly flourish our kilts all we want, historians give this one to the Irish because it is the Irish who have the first written records. But that revelation led yours truly to some very diverting taste testing, but not a lot of sermon material. Not that I plan to share with you lot anyway. So anyway, I threw my net a little wider. St. Patrick was my first catch. Patrick, who apparently is not a saint, but does have this grand tale of driving the snakes out of Ireland. Maybe you've heard that one. Looking at that story, that's when I learned that there have never been snakes in Ireland, and this is why I have trust issues. Instead, there used to be a lot of pagans with wild and wonderful stories of fairies, the Danishi, the Tuatha Dé Danann, and a host of wild and wonderful characters whose names Michael Mackey will happily pronounce for you during coffee hour. These creatures of myth and legend have been transmogrified via the magic of Catholic cultural appropriation into Christian demons, like the clever slithery beastie in the Garden of Eden, and that is what conversion to Christianity cast out of the green garden of Era. Or so the story of St. Patrick goes. The snakes, just a wee bit of Blarney added to spice up a good story. Here's another good story. Chicago. Once upon a time, this region around us was the West. It's not that California wasn't a thing. This is just how far, really, that America had gotten. Chicago, at least as colonialist Americans know it, cites 1837 as its founding date. And as you will likely recall from our opening words, our church was only founded 5 years later. But the Chicago of then was definitely a far cry from the Chicago of now. No one was dumping hundreds of pounds of emerald green dye into anything, much less a river. When the potato famine began in 1845, many Irish people left Ireland behind. They settled all over, really, wherever there was work. My own Irish ancestors ended up, again, all over. The Kearneys went to New York City. The Forsyths went to Pennsylvania. The Clulows and the Skays landed near D.C. The Morans ended up in Baltimore and Chicago. And for those of you familiar with Prohibition-era Chicago history, and specifically the history of organized crime here in Chicago, Bugsy Moran is not a direct ancestor, and that is the story the FBI tells me I should stick to. But Chicago is where a lot of Irish people came. Chicago was, as you know, an immigrant town out there on the frontier, so to speak. There was opportunity here. And unlike many immigrant communities flooding into the United States during the 19th century, the Irish were white and spoke English. And that helped. The construction of the Michigan Canal, the American train system, and farming kept them here. And there's a recent book out of NIU, The Irish in Illinois, which goes into this in a lot more detail. As for me, I have never been to Ireland. This is a gap I hope to remedy someday, but what most intrigues me about my homeland is not the whiskey or the boiled potatoes, it's the stories. As we heard in today's Time for All Ages, the stories of the Irish are, let's just say, colorful. Blarney filled, which is different than baloney filled. And as we learned in the Ring of Truth, the point of Blarney is not to really deceive so much as to butter up, to flatter. In much the same way, the honey attracts more flies than vinegar. My mother, God rest her weary soul, used to say that I was, quote, full of it. I choose to believe that she meant Blarney. And that's why Blarney is probably a better title for today's sermon. Anyway, while I was digging around, I found a lot of familiar and unfamiliar Irish stories, legends, and myths. Heroic figures like Cuchulainn, Finn MacCool, and Mad Sweeney. Tragic figures like Cuchulainn, Finn MacCool, and Mad Sweeney. I found lots of poems by Yeats, great stuff. One of my favorites, The Stolen Child, has haunted me since I was very young. Maybe you know this line. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world is more full of weeping than you can understand. If you're sensing a theme, you're not the only one. Not a lot of happy endings there were for the Irish. One of the many things I was curious about is this transition, though, from great big fairies to little tiny fairies. Because once upon a time, the Fomorians, who keep coming up in these old stories, were not tiny. They were giants. The word Fomorian has an unclear etymology, but the translation I happen to like is giants from under the sea, which makes them sound terrifying. Like Norse myth, turns out that the Irish stories have a lot of giants. The Tua de Danann are described as giants of the earth, sometimes huge in size, but always huge in power, strength, and magic. I suppose you could say they're very much like the Asgardians of Northern Europe or the Olympians of the ancient Mediterranean. The stories pit them against the Fomorians, and these giants from under the sea are often depicted as grotesque, monstrous, and awful, much like the Titans are when compared to the Olympians. After many battles and trials and trickery, the Fomorians are cast into the sea, more than once actually. And after that, ever after, the heroes of old are set to watch for their return, this threat that would one day come back from the waves that surround Ireland. To my untutored ears, the Fomorians sound a great deal like Vikings, raiders from over the sea. Given that the vast majority of the stories we have of ancient Ireland come from the Dark Age clerics who split their time between transcribing these tall tales, farming, and distilling some epic homebrew, and also given that longboat raiding parties between the Celtic nations was apparently very common even during Roman occupation, long before the Danes ever bothered to sail west, stories like these make a lot of sense. Our St. Patrick himself was said to have been abducted in just such a raid. Patricius was the son of a Roman tax collector, the grandson of a Christian priest. When he was 16 years old, somewhere around the year 405 of the Common Era, he was abducted from his home on the Welsh coast by Irish longboat raiders and sold into slavery. And for the next 6 years, he struggled, tending the pig herd of a local warlord in Northern Ireland. At some point, he escaped, made it to the coast, and through a Hollywood-worthy series of mishaps, angels managed to smuggle him aboard a ship back to England. Some years later, he returned to Ireland, evangelized the chieftains, and had that moment with the snakes. Or so Patrick tells us in his autobiography, The Confessio. But in 2019, Roy Fleckner of the University of Dublin has a slightly different story. His book, St. Patrick Retold, suggests that Patrick's self-told story is a myth. And while abduction and enslavement were quite common, it is much more likely that a young, but certainly not teenage Patrick, took his family and wealth and deliberately fled to Ireland, quote, to avoid inheriting his father's job as a Roman tax collector, which was becoming an increasingly dangerous and financially risky job in the collapsing empire, since collectors were responsible for making up shortfalls out of their own pockets. Now, Patrick's own account lets slip that when he was about the business of converting the pagans, he had some unusual financial resources. Fleckner wonders if Patrick's near magical access to Irish nobility, which would be inexplicable to someone who claimed to be a former slave, perhaps came from the rather large gifts that he was able to make. Maybe he just bought his way in. Today, it's unclear whether this wealth came from whether Patrick was magical or found his pot of gold. He never really says. Fleckner, however, does suggest that selling slaves was quite common and accepted in early Roman Christian society, and it should be considered a serious possibility, but we will never know. What we do know is that the traditional stories and legends we have of Patrick were given to us by Patrick himself, and we are free to wonder if the stories he chose to tell us are less how it went than how he wanted it remembered. We have another word for flattering storytelling, don't we? Blarney! Anyone here remember the 2003 movie Big Fish? Anybody see that movie? Such a great movie. It's a sweet and lovely film. It's a Tim Burton film, so there's some fantastic visuals. But Albert Finney steals the show. He plays the dad, a well-known teller of tall tales who chose to live his rather ordinary life in a way that was anything but ordinary. I recommend a visit for those of you that have never seen it, or a revisit whenever you can manage it. I'll offer that at one point in my life, I would have been as frustrated as his own son, the son who wanted to know something true about his dad. But now I find myself frustrated with that son, who was not willing to let a little magic into his life, to rewrite that drab and humdrum that is far too often our daily bread. So here's a Blarney-filled contrast with that film. Anybody remember the 1997 movie with Jim Carrey, Liar, Liar? Right? Carrey plays a lawyer who finds himself cursed to speak the truth for one full day. As you can imagine, his entire life comes unglued in some spectacular ways. I can honestly say that I have no idea what my life would be like if I had to speak the truth and only the truth all the time. For those of you that think you can pull it off, I can only commend the movie and wish you good luck with that. So today, and in the spirit of truth and story, I ask you, when was the last time you embellished, filigreed, colored up, or flat out lied about something from your past? And not just to your children. Speaking for myself, there are quite a few stories that I have absolutely no intention of ever telling my kids. And I'm rather confident that I'm not the only one with that plan. And no, I don't mean the big stuff. I mean, after all, I'm very aware that we're living in a post-truth political landscape. I will be the very first to say that truth is important. I am aware of the damage a lie can bring. Anybody remember the one describing the January 6th insurrectionists as, quote, a bunch of tourists? Or the one that said the victims of the Parkland shooting were, quote, crisis actors? Or when Obama said, if you like your health care plan, you can keep it. How about Sarah Palin's death panels? Anybody remember that one? Or the one by Colin Powell about yellow cake uranium? Remember those? Good times, right? Now, with Blarney, I'm talking about the other stuff, the creative and charming untruths that we routinely share. You are the most beautiful person in the world. All that matters is that you do your best. Cake has no calories. Everything is better after a sleep and a snack. All you need is love. These little lies, the little kisses of kindness that we share with others to help them get through their day. It's not that we're all liars. I mean, we probably are. You probably are. At least to some extent, right? We tell stories to strangers, our colleagues, our friends, our family, ourselves. How often do we polish ourselves, smooth out our own edges, sand over those rough spots, fill in the cracks, repaint the parts that are clearly chipped? I want to say that this blarnifying is quite reflexive, totally natural, and happens all the time. It lets a little magic in. For example, have I ever told you that my 17-year-old son has multiple PhDs? Multiple PhDs is what he tells me. One of them apparently is in hunter-gathering, but at last count, that was just one of 7, right? One of 7. Feel free to ask him about it. I'm sure he'll be delighted to tell you more. Today, though, I do find myself in this weird place. Once upon a time, I was very much a believer in this truth will set you free. Today, I'm a little less certain. Which truth is a question I find myself asking more and more. Because truth is a complicated thing. And some of those truths, the Blarney ones, sometimes they're just easier on the heart. Speaking of which, have I ever told you the story about my granddad and Adlai Stevenson? No? All right, well, apparently old Adlai was a huge fan of my granddad. In fact, everyone loved granddad, and it's really not hard to see why. He traveled the world for the State Department, and his job was to set the cost of living index for foreign service folks living abroad. Granddad would come visit you, and shortly after, you got a raise. Yeah, Granddad was really popular. So popular that when Adlai was running against old Ike, he was asked about possible cabinet positions. And don't you know, my old granddad was given the nod for Secretary of State. Can you imagine that? It's the God's honest truth.
Visit us at UUSG.org.